Continuing our series in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, "Imitate me just like I imitate Christ." Wow. I mean, Paul said the same thing exactly in Philippians 3:17 and in 2 Thessalonians 3:7 through 9, a little expanded. The author of Hebrews wrote that we should imitate godly leaders in Hebrews 6 and Hebrews 13. The Apostle John said we should imitate what is good in 3 John, 10, 11, 12, something in there. 11, I think. But people, this is a great concept, not only from a spiritual standpoint, but in all of life. If you want to be successful at being a Christian or doing anything at all, find someone that is good at what you want to learn and then imitate them, until you figure things out for yourself. No doubt the Corinthians thought Paul was worthy of being imitated. So verses 2 and 3. Oh, and yeah, again, I keep saying this. 1 Corinthians 11:1 is talking about what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10. That's the way he lived. Imitate him. 1 Corinthians 11:1, in my opinion, should be the last verse of 1 Corinthians 10, but it works well at 1 Corinthians 11, so be it. Just read everything in context, people. Verses 2 and 3. It makes me feel good to know that you remember what I have taught you. It honors me that you are doing what I taught you. However, it is very important that you remember that Christ is the head of every man, just like the husband is the head of his wife. And the head of Christ is God. Now, before anyone gets upset because Paul wasn't being politically correct and I didn't correct his writing, so I'm not politically correct either. Hey, if Paul can do it, so can I. Hold on, though. It's going to become clear that Paul isn't as far out as you think. So take time to think about ancient cultures. In most families, men and women both worked, and they worked hard. But men were the protectors, and they did the most of the heavy lifting. That was just the way society was back then. That is not to say that the man was smarter or the woman had to be a slave. Without trying to be too cute here, almost everyone knows that some men are smarter than their wife, and some wives are smarter than their husbands. Either way, marriages work best if the couple works together. Also, every woman and a few men know that a smart wife can manage to control what she wants no matter who's the head of the house. My wife and I have always divided who's in charge of what. The division has changed several times over the years as our lives have changed. Who does the laundry, who does the grocery shopping, who runs the budget, who is in charge of vehicles, the house, blah, 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 blah. Enough marriage counseling. We work together. The following, I'm gonna go back and read verse 3 again, and then continue through verse 6 here. However, it is very important that you remember that Christ is the head of every man, just like the husband is the head of his wife, and the head of Christ is God. When a man prays or prophesies with his head covered, he dishonors himself. But if a woman prays or prophesies without a covering on her head, she dishonors herself. It would be like shaving her head. In fact, if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. Okay, so do you understand what Paul's teaching here? He seems to be saying that there's a difference between men and women. In their culture, the difference was very distinct. Women who were guilty of a serious offense in most Greek cultures and many others of that time in the Middle East would have their hair cut off. When someone wanted to shame men in many cultures, especially in the Middle East, they would shave off their beard. In 2 Samuel 10, David had sent some emissaries somewhere, I forgot, and the king there shaved half their beards off and did some other shameful things. That was humiliating to them. Paul seems to say we need to respect the difference between men and women. Was the covering the important thing? Probably not, since Paul didn't mention anything about Christ wearing a head covering or not. But a head covering was not common among men, unless they were a soldier or they wore some sort of ceremonial head covering like religious leaders. So perhaps that was the thing. The man should not cover his head because head coverings made them seem special. Women, on the other hand, wore a head covering to indicate they were submissive. As in, they did not wear it in the house or with close family, and this practice continues in much of the Middle East today. They only wore the head covering when they were in public. Now think about it, and you should understand. The point is about submission. Women wore a head covering to show submission. Men only wore a head covering when they wanted people to think they were more important. So Paul's going to continue. Bear with me through the next 4 verses, and then we'll get to the part where Paul makes it all clear. 7 through 10. A man should not cover his head because he is made in God's image, reflecting God's glory, and a woman reflects the glory of man. The first man did not come from a woman, but the first woman came from a man. Man was not created for woman, but woman was created for man. That is why a woman should cover her head, because of the angels. All right, in 11 and 12, Paul's going to continue and explain everything. However, before you ask me, verse 10, because of the angels, what does that mean? Do you know? I don't. It just isn't clear, and anyone who teaches something about this is just speculating. Some of their speculations are interesting. Some are outright foolish. But let's see what Paul's talking about in all of this as it applies to the Corinthian Christians and to us today. Verses 11 and 12. Concerning Christians, women are not independent of men, and men are not independent of women. Although the first woman came from a man, every man after that came from a woman. But everything comes from God. Do you understand? Paul is saying that regardless of cultural norms, for Christians, things are different. He says the same thing in Galatians 3:28. He says, there's no difference between slave and free, male or female, Greek or Jew, Gentile or Jew. I forget the exact quote, and I probably got them out of sequence. Go read Galatians 3:28. Straighten me out. But this was not just for the Corinthians. Paul taught the same thing to the Galatians, and no doubt everywhere he went, as he's about to say. And that's why we should always consider the entire Bible and not take verses or passages or even chapters out of context. Verses 13 to 16, Paul says, think about it. Decide for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God in public without wearing a head covering? Is it proper for a man to have long hair, or is that disgraceful? Isn't it proper for a woman to have long hair, her pride and joy? If someone wants to argue with me about this, my answer is that I have no other practice, neither do any churches of God. More cultural differences. People, that's why I talk about culture all the time. It's hard to understand the Bible if you don't understand the culture in which it was written. So most ancient cultures, long beards and long hair on men symbolized maturity. However, Alexander the Great started a trend of marrying men wearing short hair and no beards a few hundred years before this. This was based on athletics and military. Hair and beards can be used against you when you're wrestling and fighting. You know, they can grab you and twist your head around. Yeah, plus it hurts. You got no hair? It's hard to pull the eyebrows, right? So, since Corinth was a Greek city, the men there did not wear long hair. They considered it disgraceful. Women, on the other hand, in almost every culture in ancient days, and many today, women typically wore long hair. The longer, the better. You know, when I was a young man, many churches used this passage to say men had to have short hair and women had to have long hair. And some churches still teach that. However, those who teach that do not understand the cultural differences. Especially that Jewish men, including Jesus, had long hair and long beards. Go read Leviticus 19:27, where it says, "Don't trim the hair don't cut the hair on the sides of your head or trim your beards." Hello? He wasn't talking to the women. I always found it humorous that in those churches, including in my youth, their pictures of Jesus showed him with long hair and a long beard. But they didn't want me to have long hair, and I had shoulder length. A little shorter than this, but not much. It's a length I've always liked. Anyway, whatever. So now we're going to come to what I consider the key passage in the whole book of Corinthians, but especially chapters 10 and 11. 1 Corinthians 11, 17 to the end of the chapter. Paul starts in 17 to 19. He says, "Now in the following teachings I cannot praise your meetings. They do more harm than good. I hear that when you gather together, you have divisions among you. And to an extent, I believe what I have heard. Of course, there are always differences among people, and some differences allow God's people to be recognized." Divisions. You know, Paul points out in some other epistles that divisions can be bad, but not all divisions are bad. We're all different from each other. You know, some people get along better than others. But remember what Paul said in the previous chapter. Do what is best for others. Sometimes it's best to become friends with those we don't necessarily like. Unity is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile, people. And if you consider yourself a leader in God's church, you better make sure that you are building relationships with everyone, trying to include everyone in the church. Perhaps that's just my opinion, but I think Paul's saying that here. 20 through 22, Paul says, "When you gather together, you don't actually gather to share in the Lord's Supper. When you gather together, some of you eat your own meal and don't share with others. Some of your church have nothing to eat and others get drunk. What is up with that? You have your own homes to eat and drink in. You disgrace God's church by humiliating the people who have nothing. What am I supposed to say to you? Do you expect my praise? I will not praise you for this issue. He's praised them in this epistle. He always does. But he doesn't pull his punches either. Communion for them was not like what we participate in. The early Christians, except in Corinth, the early Christians shared meals, and communion was part of the meal. Or in Corinth, they weren't sharing their meals. Can you picture what early churches practiced? And then think about what they were doing in Corinth. It's quite different than what we practice today. Would you like to share meals like that every time we held church? Certainly not something Christians seem inclined to practice. When I was a young man, fresh out of the Army, we attended a church that had, after Sunday night service, they had a potluck for everyone, every Sunday night. Now, it came about because the local Christian Bible school that they were affiliated with did not have evening meals at the cafeteria at the college. So the church fed the students, and everyone shared that meal. Now, they did not share communion during that meal, but hey, kind of nice. And now in 23 through 26, we are going to get to the passage that is read just before communion more often than any other Bible passage. 23 through 26. Let me tell you what Jesus himself told me. On the night when he was betrayed, Jesus took some bread and gave thanks to God for that bread. Then he broke it apart and passed it to his disciples as he told them, "This is my body which is being sacrificed for you. Do this to remember me." Then he took a cup of wine after they had eaten supper. He told them, "This cup is the new covenant which will be confirmed by my blood. Do this to remember me. Every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you are remembering your Lord's death until he returns." People, do not take this for granted simply because you have heard it many times. Take time to contemplate what Jesus said. Some churches, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, take communion at every service. Some only share communion once a month, or once a quarter, or once a year, or even less often. And some never share communion at all. If you were in charge of a church, how often would you want to share communion? Don't just assume what your preference is, but think about what you think the Bible teaches. Think about what would be the best for the majority of Christians. Verse 27, anyone who eats and drinks the elements of communion when they are not worthy, they are guilty of sinning against the Lord's body and blood. Whoa. This verse is not always read before communion. What do you believe about this verse? What does it mean to share communion in an unworthy manner? Let's keep reading. 28 to 30. Paul says, "Examine yourself carefully before you eat the bread and drink from the cup. If you eat the bread or drink from the cup without honoring the body of Christ, you are bringing judgment on yourselves. That is why many of you are weak and sick. That is why some have even died." This passage is also not always read before communion. What is Paul teaching here? He says by not honoring Christ, Christians end up weak or sick or even dead. Do you believe that? It's in the Bible. And what does it mean by not honoring Christ? Is it as simple as having total apathy towards the entire communion service? Think about it. Verses 31 to 32. If we examined ourselves carefully, we would not be judged in this manner. Remember that when God judges us in this manner, He is disciplining us so that we will not be condemned along with the worldly people. This passage is almost never read before communion. Examine yourself carefully. Do you do that before sharing communion? In most churches where we hear this passage read, we are given a few seconds to think about it. Shouldn't this be something we think about even before we go to church? Do Christians do that? What are we examining ourselves for? Verses 33 and the first part of 34. My dear brothers and sisters, when you gather together, share your meal with everyone all together. If you are too hungry to wait for everyone else, then eat something before you leave home. That way God will not condemn you. Think about how the Corinthians were practicing communion as you read these last two verses. Does all of this make more sense now? It should, and you would understand even better if you spent a little time reviewing this chapter one more time. Last half of verse 34 finishes the chapter with this. Paul says, when I arrive in Corinth again, I will give you additional instructions. What would they think about that?